Hello, this is Dr. Esa, and welcome back to the series God and Money in the Bible. In this last session about wisdom literature, we will look at the book of Job and Ecclesiastes. In the previous section, we saw that wisdom of the Proverbs focuses on retribution theology. In other words, if a person follows the way of wisdom, good consequences will follow. However, if a person follows the way of folly or foolishness, negative consequences will follow. And as to the foundation of wisdom, it is the fear of the Lord. Despite the retribution theology, we can also see in the book of Proverbs the counter testimony, which problematizes the easy notions of action consequence theology or the retribution. Yet, this stream is less prominent in the book of Proverbs. As we start looking at the wisdom in the book of Job and Ecclesiastes, we can see that the traditional retribution theology is problematized more forcefully than in the book of Proverbs. Finally, though we don't have much time to look at Psalms, the Psalms exhibit a mixture of perspective, both affirming and problematizing the retribution theology. Let me reiterate briefly the storyline of Job. As we all remember, Job was an upright and wealthy family man, but in a series of events, he loses his possessions, his family, and even his health. On the background, there's a hidden conversation between God and Hashatan, or the accuser. Their conversation revolves around the idea whether Job is godly just because he can gain a blessing. So God agrees that Satan is able to test Job and to see whether he retains his integrity. And after Job has lost everything, a dialogue ensues between Job and his friends, which revolves around the question, why is Job suffering? Job claims to be innocent and demands justice and answers from God, whereas his friends insist that Job is suffering due to his own sin. At the background, obviously, is the theology of retribution that frames the discussion. Why is Job suffering? Is it because of his sins and his rebellion? Perhaps he has neglected the poor, and that's why all of this suffering comes upon him. Job dismisses these charges, whereas his friends uphold them. Finally, Job is vindicated, and God appears to him in a series of speeches. The final answer comes when Job is actually blessed and to be shown that he was in the right, and his friends were wrong at accusing him. However, we could also ponder, is the retribution theology affirmed or negated in this theology of Job? So let's look at some of the few dialogues between Job and his friends as an example to show how the themes of wealth, possessions, and theology of retribution frames the discussion. Job was blameless, upright, wealthy, wise, and respected. However, Job's condition after losing all of this is absolutely horrifying. Job 3:24-26, Job states, "For my groaning comes at the sight of my food, and my cries pour out like water. For what I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I'm not at ease, nor am I quiet, and I am not at rest, but turmoil comes." In the previous comments, we saw that Job's worst nightmare had come upon him. And as his friends try to comfort him, they start to give some reasons why they thought that Job was in this predicament. Chapter 15, Eliphaz states in verse 20 and 29, "The wicked man writhes in pain all his days, and numbered are the years stored up for the ruthless. He will not become rich, nor will his wealth endure, and his grain will not bend down to the ground. In chapter 20, Zophar states, he or the wicked swallow riches but will vomit them up. God will expel them from his belly. He sucks the poison of cobras. The viper's tongue slays him. He does not look at the streams, the rivers flowing with honey and curds. He returns what he has attained and cannot swallow it. As to the riches of his trading, he cannot even enjoy. For he has oppressed and forsaken the poor. He has seized a house which he has not built. These words that are directed towards Job, even though are framed in a general manner, indicate that wicked are punished and they will end up poor, and that riches obtained by wickedness cannot even be enjoyed. And finally, retribution theology is affirmed. Those who are evil, those who are wicked, those who don't care for the poor and the orphan, the widow, will experience calamity and judgment. And even despite the fact that they might be robbing the poor and they have wealth, they will not be ever able to enjoy that. And that wealth will be fleeting in the first place. Job, however, protests. He's not satisfied with this kind of simplistic notion of retribution theology, especially as it applied to his conditions. So Job tells in chapter 21, why do the wicked still live, continue also become very powerful? Behold, their prosperity is not in their hand. The counsel of the wicked is far from me. How often is the lamp of the wicked put out? Or does the calamity fall on them? Does God apportion destruction in his anger? One dies in his full strength, being wholly at ease and satisfied. His sides are filled out with fat, and the marrow of his bones is moist. Job protests the simplistic notion of his friends and protests the accusations. Wicked prosper and calamity is far from them. This is a complete opposition to the notion that God blesses the good people and judges the evil ones. And Job continues to say that the wicked die in prosperity and live a long life. In other words, their prosperity is not short-lived, but they're actually enjoying their wealth and they're living a long life. Retribution theology and God's justice is challenged by Job. Job's friends continue to challenge him, and Eliphaz says in chapter 22, verses 5 to 11, is not your wickedness great and your iniquities without end? For you, Job, have taken pledges of your brothers without cause, and stripped men naked. To the weary you have given no water to drink, and from the hungry you have withheld bread. But the earth belongs to the mighty man, and the honorable man dwells in it. You have sent down widows away empty, and the strength of the orphans has been crushed. Therefore snares surround you, and sudden dread terrifies you, or darkness, so that you cannot see, and an abundance of waters covers you. Notice how Eliphaz specifically accuses Job of neglecting and oppressing the poor and the vulnerable. Therefore, punishment is on him. As Job continues his lament, he is not only looking at his own condition of misery, but he starts to accuse God of injustice as well. Chapter 24, why are times not stored up by the Almighty? And why do those who know him not see his days? Some remove the landmarks. They seize and devour flocks. They drive away the donkeys of the orphans. They take the widow's ox for a pledge. They push the needy aside from the road. The poor of the land are made to hide themselves together. Behold, as wild donkeys in the wilderness, they go forth, seeking food in the activity, as the bread or their children in the desert. They harvest their fodder in the field and glean the vineyard of the wicked. They spend the night naked without clothing and have no covering against the cold. They are wet with the mountain rains and hug the rock for want of a shelter. Others snatch the orphan from the breast, and against the poor they take a pledge. They cause the poor to go about naked without clothing, and they take away the sheaves from the hungry. Within the walls they produce oil, they tread winepresses but thirst. From the city men groan, and the souls of the wounded cry out. Yet God does not pay attention to folly. Others have been with those who rebel against the light. They do not know its ways nor abide in its paths. The murderer arises at dawn, he kills the poor and needy, and at night he is as a thief. If we were to look at the details in this passage, you can see so many allusions to the Exodus and Deuteronomy, where God specifically told that people are not to oppress the poor and the widow and the orphan and the alien. However, in this passage, Job is actually accusing God that he does not pay attention to the wickedness and injustice that is happening in the world. Does not God care how the wicked oppress and exploit the poor and the vulnerable? And by implication, Job is saying that he has not done that. Finally, in chapter 31, Job indicates that he has actually practiced justice as God had commanded. If I have kept the poor from their desire, or have caused the eye of the widow to fail, or have eaten the morsel alone, and the orphan has not shared it. But from my youth he grew up with me as with a father, and from infancy I guided her. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or that the needy had no covering, if his loins have not thanked me, and if he has not been warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have lifted up my hand against the orphan, because I saw I had support in the gate, let my shoulder fall from the socket, and my arm be broken off at the elbow. For the calamity from God is a terror to me, and because of his majesty I can do nothing. If I have put my confidence in gold, and called fine gold my trust, if I have gloated because my wealth was great, and because my hand had secured so much. In this passage, Job indicates that he has provided and defended the poor and the vulnerable, and Job vows to his integrity as the defender of the vulnerable. He has trusted God instead of riches. He is unable to practice justice now because God has inflicted calamity on him. As a result, Job's friends are wrong accusing him of neglecting the poor and the orphan and the widow. And also God's justice is questioned because he allows this injustice to go on, and all this calamity has befallen on Job. And then we come to the resolution. God appears to Job in chapters 38 to 42, and God challenges Job's limited perspective by a series of questions about the wonders and marvels of creation. Job is not able to understand the true wisdom that only God possesses. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear now, and I will speak. I will ask you, and you instruct me. I have heard of you by hearing of the ear, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I retract, and I repent in dust and ashes. In this final episode, we can see how Job humbles himself and is restored. Even in those speeches in chapter 38 to 42, Job does not receive a specific answer to his question why he was suffering. Yet his friends are rebuked. Chapter 42 verse 7 says, It came about after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, My wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, because you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has. This final words is the clear indication that challenges the position of Job's friends who were advocating a too simplistic notion of retribution theology. And at the same time, it vindicates Job and his questioning and his honest inquiries. So what does Job teach us about wealth and poverty and money and possessions? First and foremost, caring for the poor and the vulnerable is taken for granted. It is a non-negotiable part of righteousness and justice. Neither Job nor his friends are questioning whether poor should be taken care of or whether justice should be upheld for the poor and orphan, the widow, and the alien. We can also see that Job's bold questioning, when he was bringing his concerns and even his anger to God as he truly was, without hiding any of it, Job receives the final verdict that he was speaking what is right, whereas his friends did not. Retribution theology frames the dialogue. So what is the result or the resolution to the retribution theology? Was Job right, or was his friends right, in terms of does God judge the wicked, and does he bless the righteous and the wise with wealth and well-being? First of all, Job's experience and observations are not incorrect. Injustice does happen, unrighteousness does happen, and also the poor and the orphan, the widow do experience injustice. However, no reason is given specifically for that question. Perhaps this sort of questioning by Job, raising up an important issues in the surrounding society or community, is actually very important. In doing this, Job exposes the injustices of the world. And that is also the task of the church today, to speak out against the injustice. Whatever might be the reason for it, that needs to be brought forward. How is then retribution theology formulated here? Well, in the book of Job, we can see the perspective of God's sovereignty and sacred wisdom are foregrounded. There's no final resolution for why does evil happen to good people like Job, but only God's sovereignty, his mystery and superior wisdom is brought forward. Is retribution rejected altogether, or is it just qualified? That is a question that is not easy to answer. For sure, we can say that retribution is at least very well qualified. But we do see how in the end Job is blessed and how he will receive manyfold back for all that he lost. At the same time, he lost his children, obviously something that could be never regained. We can also see that in the book of Job, poverty is caused by exploitation. God is not who brings about poverty or misery. It is mainly brought about by injustices and by unjust people. Finally, we can see that Job's experience opens up a window to a real experience of poverty. In chapters 19 and chapters 3 and many other places, we can see sections that many people with HIV, homelessness, and people who are in extreme difficult situations can identify with. So let's look at finally the book of Ecclesiastes and its views on money, wealth, and possessions, and especially the retribution theology. Sometimes the book of Ecclesiastes has been called yes, but theology because of its perplexing and complex nature. Before we look at more specifically the nature of possessions, wealth, and poverty in Ecclesiastes, let's look at the basic framework for understanding Kohelet, or the preacher's perspective on possessions. First of all, he says that everything is vanity, or breath, wind, nothingness, as the Hebrew word havel indicates. Chapter 1 verse 2 says, "Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. In other words, everything is just a breath of air or nothingness as you look at them from the big scheme of things. This includes many things that are considered very worthwhile or good in other parts of the Old Testament, such as wisdom and labor, pleasure, self-indulgence, money, power, and fame. Even though wisdom is considered as vanity, it still is considered of higher importance than money, power, and fame. Yet, at the end, it will help nothing because everything is vanity in the big picture. None of these can provide ultimate significance for human life. As we saw in the previous wisdom books of Proverbs and Job, Ecclesiastes also discusses and reflects on the action-consequence theology. And as in Job, there's a tension between the received retribution theology that is connected to wisdom and the current experiences as Kohelet is looking around the life that is happening. And in the perspective of the Kohelet, action-consequence theology is partially approved, but more often it is contested and problematized. For example, 2:26 says, "For to a person who is good in his sight, he has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner he has given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to one who is good in God's sight. This too is vanity and striving after the wind." As can be seen in this particular passage, the Kohelet is actually approving, at least partially, the notion of wisdom accompanied by joy, knowledge, wisdom, and even wealth. Nevertheless, at the end, this too is vanity and striving after the wind, problematizes, though only slightly, that perspective. Yet this traditional retribution perspective is contested through repetition of the word vanity and how everything is vanity, and also what we could also call the counter sayings. For example, in chapter 7, verses 15 and 16, we're told, "I have seen everything during my lifetime of futility. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his wickedness. Do not be excessively righteous, and do not be overly wise. Why should you ruin yourself?" In this passage, we can clearly see that Kohelet is observing life around him, and he said that he has seen righteous people who perishes in his righteousness, and also wicked people who prolong their life in their wickedness. In other words, the notion of retribution and God's equal distribution of justice according to one's deeds does not come to pass. And as a result of that, he gives a practical assessment and advice for everyone not to be excessively righteous or overly wise. This statement is very similar to some of the Psalms, where the psalmist is actually crying out to God for justice because he has seen so much injustice around him and how the wicked prosper and how the righteous are perishing. Despite the fact that all is vanity, Ecclesiastes concludes with a commendation for good works and wisdom. Chapter 12, verses 13 to 14 says, "The conclusion when all has been heard is, fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil." So here we can see a very practical and sensible course of action on the part of Ecclesiastes. He says that at the end, obey God, fear God, and every act will be brought to judgment. Despite all appearances of injustice, vanity is there, but God's justice ultimately will prevail. Its outworking may be mysterious, but don't be fooled by the outward appearance. Just obey God and fear him. In other words, wisdom largely eludes, though action consequence theology is not completely dismissed. In other words, old wisdom of action, consequence, and retribution are set alongside a new experience, what is observed around, that retains and it is in tension and in dialogue with the old notions of retribution. Ideas of God's sovereignty and otherness, and his mysterious art workings are affirmed and even reflected on. Traditional elements of fear of God and obedience are affirmed, but not naively, nor simplistically, but with the sense of mystery and awesome power of God. With this basic framework in mind, so let us look at how Ecclesiastes perceives the notions of wealth, poverty, and justice in light of retribution theology and in light of its problematization. As you may recall, the book of Proverbs included many observations about the poverty and how people in poverty and oppression live in precarious conditions. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 verses 1 to 3 is very similar. Then I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun. And behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and that they had no one to comfort them. And on the side of their oppressors was power, but they had no one to comfort them. So I congratulated the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still living. But better off than both of them is the one who has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. This passage is surely pessimistic as it can be. Kohelet is observing the world around him and seeing oppression and the predicament of the poor. And obviously this is a perspective from the one who is not himself poor or oppressed. Nevertheless, he sees that the oppressors have the power and they are basically uncontested. In other words, he is reflecting on the theodic challenge. In other words, he's wondering and observing, and very pessimistically as that, of why is there so much evil? Why is there so much oppression and poverty in the world? And Kohelet feels helpless and almost feels like he wants to resign from this whole life that might be even called just a game. This is surely something that we today can very much identify with. There's so much poverty, so much suffering in the world, and we often feel like we're completely helpless to the point when we want to just resign and not to do anything. And the only cure that Ecclesiastes posits for himself is to enjoy what God has given. That will come a little bit later in chapter 8, verse 15. God has given food and drink and feelings of pleasure which one should enjoy. And even all this, Ecclesiastes says, is given from God and should be enjoyed in this fleeting time on this earth while one is still alive. Ecclesiastes also reflects on wealth and specifically its fleeting nature. Chapters 5 verses 10 to 20. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. When good things increase, those who consume them increase. So what is the advantage to their owners except to look for one? The sleep of the working man is pleasant, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich does not allow him to sleep. There is grievous evil which I have seen under the sun. Riches being hoarded by their owner to his hurt. When those riches were lost through a bad investment and he had fathered a son, then there was nothing to support him. As he had come naked from his mother's womb, so will he return as he came. He will take nothing from the fruit of his labor that he can carry in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Exactly as a man is born, thus will he die. So what is the advantage of him who toils for the wind? Throughout his life he also eats in darkness with great vexation, sickness, and anger. Here is what I have seen to be good and fitting, to eat, to drink, and to enjoy oneself in one's labor in which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life which God has given him. For this is his reward. Furthermore, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and to receive his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God, for he will not often consider the years of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of his heart. Here we can see how the Kohelet is reflecting on the wealth. He indicates that there's never enough wealth for the one who is looking for it and desirous of it. And also that possessions bring different kinds of people who attach themselves to the wealthy persons, and the wealth will also bring worry. Anxiety of the rich over possessions is contrasted with the sweet sleep of the workers. This is a little bit ideal, nevertheless indicates how much worries the rich people often have. Also, the workers' conditions here are idealized and looked upon from the perspective of the wealthy. Ultimately, wealth does not bring happiness, and that is the conclusion of the Kohelet, even though they may be helpful and even can be enjoyed. Yet what about what to do when the wealth is lost? The nature of wealth is fleeting indeed. All the wealth, all the toil that produces the wealth does not guarantee the permanence and security of wealth. Even the wealthy person does not have guarantees that he is able to support even one's own family, because the wealth can come in and it can go out as quickly as it came in. And ultimately, everybody returns to the nakedness at death, so that the death is considered here as a great equalizer of wealthy and the poor, men and women, and everyone who lives on this earth. Everyone is confronted with life's evils and ills, whether that's sickness or trouble, and ultimately, rich and poor are equal in death. Yet, since life is fleeting, Kohelet encourages those who have wealth to enjoy what God gives. God does not only give wealth, but he also gives the ability for people to enjoy it. However, even though sometimes God provides wealth, some he does not provide with the enjoyment that can gain from that. But those to whom God does give wealth and the ability to enjoy, this enjoyment helps one to forget the ultimate fate of everyone, that everybody will die and all things will be equalized as the death comes knocking. As was seen, Kohelet's perspective on wealth is somewhat ambiguous. On the other hand, it is a gift of God, but without the gift of enjoyment, it is not much worth anything. However, Kohelet does not say that the person who is wealthy is blessed necessarily, but neither does he say that poverty is a curse or judgment of God. As a matter of fact, poverty and wisdom are better than wealth and many other things. Chapter 9, verses 13 to 18 says, "Also this I came to see as wisdom under the sun, and it has impressed me. There was a small city with few men in it, and a great king came to it, surrounded it, and constructed large siege works around it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he delivered the city by his wisdom. Yet no man remembered the poor man. So I said, wisdom is better than strength. But the wisdom of the poor man is despised, and his words are not heeded. The words of the wise heard in quietness are better than the shouting of ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good." Here we can see a lot of the profound wisdom and reflection on the part of the Kohelet. Let's look at some simple parts about this saying. First of all, he says that wisdom is better than wealth and power. Poor, even though they are supremely wise, are despised, neglected, and forgotten. And we can see from this saying also that poor can indeed be wise and not be materially wealthy. And overall, the ones who are poor, be they wise or foolish, they are neglected and despised, and even marginalized, regardless of what they have to offer. Poor are ultimately trapped no matter what they do. Again, this saying does not commend a course of action. It is just a matter of observation that Kohelet does as he looks around himself and sees that even the poor wise, even though they could contribute even as much as preventing a siege of a large city, they are despised and they are overruled by the shouting of rulers among the fools. So what is Kohelet's message on wealth, poverty, possessions? It sounds quite perplexing, doesn't it? Does Kohelet just resort to cynicism and resignation as he's observing the injustices that he's looking under the sun? For one thing, we know that he points out life's cruel realities without trying to idealize or sugarcoat any of it. He's blatant and he does not try to even give speculative reasons for many of his questions. Important critique of wealth and endless pursuit of vanities is clearly demonstrated by Kohelet. No matter how much wealth a person has, it'll ultimately come to ruin. No matter, even if one has wealth, if God doesn't give the person the ability to enjoy it, it is good for nothing. And ultimately, wealth and poverty, wisdom and foolishness are vanities of vanities. Nevertheless, he demonstrates that God-given enjoyment and goodness of material things can be actually seen as this sort of a intermediate type of blessing that can be enjoyed on this side of eternity. He also affirms the supremacy of wisdom over wealth. Even though wisdom ultimately will come to an end and ultimately is vanity, yet wisdom is better than wealth and material things. Perhaps most importantly, we can see how Kohelet critiques the simplistic notions of retribution. He problematizes and unsettles all notions that righteous will always end up in wealth or possessions or blessing or good health, or that the foolish and the sinners will ultimately experience misfortune and judgment, at least as it comes to this side of eternity. He reminds of the unpredictability of possessions and ultimately unpredictability of all aspects of life, not just for an ordinary person, not just for the poor, but even for the wealthy and the wise. Ecclesiastes ultimately in chapter 12, when all it says, when all has been said, all has been done, affirms that fear God, that is the only thing that one should consider. Yet it leaves us with an unsettled notion that God is with those who obey his commandments, and he will ultimately bring justice and righteousness to prevail. Nevertheless, where does this justice happen and how it will be worked out is left open. After all, Ecclesiastes does not entertain notions of afterlife. This leaves the message of Kohelet with an unsettling yes, obey the Lord, but how and where the notions of its outcome will be played out is left mysterious. And for that, we need to wait until the revelation is unfolded and God reveals that ultimately at the final justice and through the grace of God and through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, all people will be eligible to enter God's kingdom should they trust his provision.